She wiped grease off her knuckles with a rag that used to be white. Nobody at the county fairground knew her name meant anything. For 6 years, the only thing Sarah Bennett flew was a beat-up yellow pit special, looping over cornfields for people eating funnel cake. 2 hours later, a man who screamed at her to get off his flight line would be standing at attention, saluting her like his life depended on it. The morning had started simple enough. Fort Caldwell's training range shared a fence line with the regional airfield, and every summer the Guard let the airshow use half the tarmac. Chief Master Sergeant Dave Sullivan didn't like it. He didn't like civilians near his birds, didn't like distractions before an exercise, and he especially didn't like the woman in the faded flight suit parking her prop plane 40 yards from his Apaches. "Ma'am, this is an active flight line," he said, not looking up from his clipboard. "You need to move that thing and yourself somewhere else." Sarah just nodded. She always just nodded. If you like where this is headed, go ahead and comment where you're tuning in from. Hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps more than you'd think. Let's keep going. She didn't argue with men like Sullivan anymore. Arguing invited questions, and questions invited answers she'd spent 6 years avoiding. So she rolled her sleeves down over the faint white line on her left forearm. A scar shaped like nothing in particular, the kind people stopped asking about once they decided it wasn't interesting, and pushed her aircraft toward the grass. Fort Caldwell smelled the way it always had. JP-8 fuel baking off hot asphalt. Cut grass from the mowed safety buffer. Somewhere underneath it, faint and mineral, the smell of ozone before a storm that hadn't arrived yet. She used to love that smell. Now it just made her hands go still in a way that unsettled people, though nobody ever said why. Specialist Kevin Foster watched her from the comms trailer, headset looped around his neck, and thought there was something strange about a woman who moved airplane wheels like she was handling something far heavier. He didn't mention it. He was 22 and knew enough to the Guard that he mostly kept his mouth shut and did his job. The training exercise was supposed to be routine, a mechanized platoon running a resupply route through the range's back valley. Radio checks every 10 minutes, nothing live. Sullivan liked routine. Routine meant no paperwork. At 0913, the radio checks stopped coming. Foster keyed the mic, Vandal 16. "This is Caldwell Base. Radio check. Over. Static." He tried again. Nothing but the low hiss of an open channel and, underneath it, something that made his stomach drop before his brain caught up. The faint, rhythmic crack of small arms fire, bleeding through a hot mic somewhere out past the ridge. "Sullivan." Foster was already standing. "Sullivan. I've got Vandal 16 on an open channel and I'm hearing." "I hear it." Sullivan grabbed the headset out of Foster's hands, jaw tightening in a way that made him look 10 years older. "Gunfire. Not blank rounds. Not an exercise anymore. Get me a status. Now." A voice broke through, ragged and too fast. "Caldwell Base, Vandal 16, we are troops in contact. I say again, troops in contact, taking fire from the tree line, 2 vehicles disabled. We need air support immediately, over." Sullivan's 2 Apaches sat 40 yards away, fueled, armed, and completely useless, because both his qualified pilots were 40 minutes out at a briefing in town, and the exercise schedule had never planned for this. "Get me anybody," Sullivan said, to no one, to everyone. "Anybody rated on an Apache, I don't care who." Out by the grass, a woman in a faded flight suit had already stopped walking. Sarah heard it the way she heard everything now, half a second before it registered as sound, her body already moving before her mind finished the thought. Troops in contact. 2 vehicles down. No qualified pilots on station. She turned toward the flight line at a dead run. "Ma'am, you need to clear this area," Sullivan barked, not even looking at her. His focus locked on the radio in Foster's shaking hands. "I can fly that Apache," Sarah said. Sullivan finally looked at her. Really looked, the way people look at something they've decided isn't worth their attention and are now being forced to reconsider. A woman in a faded flight suit, grease on her hands, sunburn on her nose. "This isn't an airshow, ma'am. Step back. I'm not asking for a ride-along, Chief. I'm telling you I'm rated." Her voice didn't rise. It never rose. That, more than anything, was what made Sullivan hesitate. The flatness of it, the total absence of panic in a moment that should have produced some. Rated where? He snapped. On what? Does it matter right now? Behind them, the radio crackled again. Thinner this time, a voice trying not to sound as scared as it was. Caldwell Base, we are taking casualties. I say again, we have wounded. Where is our air support? Sullivan's eyes went from the radio to the woman to the two loaded Apaches sitting idle on his flight line. And something in his face cracked open just slightly. Get her a helmet, he said. Foster froze for half a second, then bolted for the equipment shed like the words had physically shoved him. Sarah was already walking toward the nearest Apache, and something in the way she approached it made Sullivan's stomach tighten. She didn't hesitate at the boarding ladder. She didn't fumble with the canopy latch like someone reading instructions off a checklist in her head. Her hand found the release before her eyes did, muscle memory older than the 6 years she'd spent pretending she didn't have any. Chief, she said, not turning around. I need your gun run confirmed on the same frequency as ground, and I need someone pulling my restrictions the second I'm in the air, because you're about to have questions, and I don't have time to answer them twice. Restrictions on what? Sullivan called after her. She didn't answer. She was already climbing into the front seat, hands moving across switches she hadn't touched in 6 years like they'd never left. Like the cockpit itself remembered her before she remembered it. Foster came sprinting back with a helmet, breathless, and shoved it up to her. As she pulled it on, he caught a glimpse of something stenciled faintly on the inside band, half worn away by years of sweat and washing. He didn't have time to read it. The rotors were already turning. The rotors spun up with a whine that climbed into a roar, and Sullivan felt it in his chest the way he always did, except this time it came with a question he couldn't shake. He grabbed the radio himself. Vandal 1-6, Caldwell Base. Be advised, air support is inbound, ETA 4 mics. Copy, Caldwell Base, we'll take anything at this point. Came the reply, thin and static-chewed. Sarah's voice cut through the cockpit comm, clipped and even. Caldwell Base, this is... She paused, just barely, like she was deciding whether to say a word she hadn't said out loud in 6 years. This is Nightshade. Inbound to your position. Say your grid. Foster's head snapped up. Sullivan's did too. Say again your call sign? Sullivan said into the radio, frowning. Negative time, Chief. Grid, please. The platoon leader on the ground rattled off coordinates in a voice that cracked twice. Sarah repeated them back once, clean, and the Apache lifted off the flight line in a wash of dust that sent Foster stumbling back a step. Sullivan stood there with the radio in his hand, watching the aircraft bank hard toward the ridge, and felt something cold settle behind his sternum. Nightshade. He didn't know the name, but something about the way she'd said it. Reluctant, almost embarrassed, like pulling a bandage off an old wound. Told him it wasn't a name she'd picked that morning. Foster, he said slowly. Pull personnel records. Now, I want to know who the hell just took my aircraft. In the cockpit, Sarah's hands moved through the checklist without her needing to think about it, which was, in its own way, the most unsettling part. Rotor RPM steady. Weapons systems armed, safeties off. The targeting sight dropped down over her right eye, and the valley below resolved into heat signatures and tree lines and 2 burning Humvees pouring black smoke into a clear morning sky. Her pulse didn't spike. It never did anymore. Not in moments like this. Only in quiet ones, only at night, only when there was nothing left to focus on but the ache in a scar 6 years old. Vandal 1-6, Nightshade. I have your position. I have 2 vehicles down. I have personnel in the open taking fire from the northern tree line. How copy? Copy all, Nightshade. We need that tree line suppressed. We've got 2 wounded we can't reach. Copy, wounded. Stand by. She rolled the aircraft into a shallow bank, watching muzzle flashes bloom and vanish among the trees like something breathing. Her thumb found the trigger guard the way a pianist finds a key they haven't played in years but never really forgot. Behind her, unheard, Sullivan was standing over Foster's shoulder as a database search spun on the terminal screen. A little while turning, searching a name that didn't match anything in the current roster. There's no Nightshade in this unit, Foster said, voice tight. There's no Nightshade in the whole guard database. Sullivan's jaw worked. Then widen the search. The first burst of 30mm fire cracked out over the valley, and even from the flight line, Sullivan felt it in his teeth. On the ground, Staff Sergeant Reyes hugged the dirt beside his disabled Humvee and watched the tree line erupt in a spray of splintered wood and dust. The incoming fire from the ambush stuttering, faltering, before going quiet entirely. He'd fought beside a lot of pilots. He'd never heard one sound like this. No adrenaline in the voice, no wasted words, just cold, exact calculation delivered like a weather report. Nightshade, that's a good hit. That's a good hit. Tree line is suppressed, he shouted into his radio. Copy. I have your wounded location. Talk me onto them. 20 meters north of the lead vehicle, ma'am. They can't move. One's got a leg wound. The other's unconscious. Understood. I need you to pop smoke so I know exactly where your people end and the target begins. I am not going to guess. Reyes fumbled for a smoke grenade with shaking hands. Around him, 3 of his soldiers stared up at the Apache circling low overhead, its silhouette blotting out the sun for half a second at a time, and none of them said what they were all thinking, that whoever was flying that thing flew like she'd done this 100 times before, in a place with worse weather and worse odds than this one. Back at the flight line, Foster's search finally returned something, and his stomach dropped when he saw it. Chief, he said quietly, it's not a current record. It's archived. Deep archived. Sullivan leaned over his shoulder. The screen showed a name, a rank, and a redacted block where a unit designation should have been, the kind of redaction reserved for records nobody was supposed to be pulling up on a training range terminal. Bennett, Sullivan read aloud. Captain Sarah Bennett. There's more, Foster said, scrolling. There's a citation attached. It's sealed. Sullivan stared at the screen like it had personally offended him. 6 years ago, on paper, Sarah Bennett had simply stopped existing in any capacity he recognized. No transfers, no discharge paperwork he could see. Just an abrupt, clean silence where a career should have continued. Overhead, the Apache banked hard, and Sullivan watched it with a feeling he didn't have a name for yet. Something between dread and awe. He thought about the way she'd found the boarding ladder without looking. The way her hands had moved across the switches like they belonged there. Sir, Reyes's voice crackled through the radio, tight with something that might have been relief or might have been fear. Whoever this is, she just called the wounded location before I finished giving it to her. How does she know this terrain? Nobody on the flight line had an answer for that. In the cockpit, Sarah brought the Apache down into a hover 30 feet above the smoke marker, close enough that the rotor wash flattened the grass around Reyes's position into a wide, rippling circle. Her eyes tracked the tree line, then the 2 motionless shapes on the ground, then back to the tree line, cataloging threat and priority in the space of half a breath. Vandal 1-6, be advised. I have 1 shooter remaining, northeast corner of the tree line. He's repositioning. I'm gonna hold him down while your medic moves. Go now. Moving. A soldier broke from cover in a dead sprint, hunched low, and Sarah put a burst of cannon fire into the exact spot the remaining shooter had shifted to, close enough to the medic's path that Reyes actually flinched watching it. But the rounds landed precisely where she'd said they would and nowhere else. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. It was the only part of her that hadn't changed in 6 years. The one thing that had followed her from wherever she used to be into the quiet, ordinary life she'd built out of cornfields and county fairs. Somewhere beneath the calm, a memory tried to surface. Another valley, another radio call, another name she'd been called before Nightshade, and she pushed it back down where it belonged, because there wasn't time, because there was never time, because the wounded soldier below her still needed 30 more seconds of sky she wasn't ready to give up yet. The medic reached the wounded soldiers and dropped into a crouch beside them, hands moving fast over a leg wound that had soaked through 2 layers of fabric. Nightshade, I've got 1 conscious, 1 unconscious. I need extraction. We cannot carry them out on foot. Copy. Hold position. Sarah's eyes flicked to her fuel gauge, then to the ridge behind her, doing math she didn't say out loud. Vandal 1-6, what's your nearest hard extraction point? There's a logging road half a click east, but it's inside the Treline's field of fire. Not anymore, it isn't. She rolled the Apache into a tight turn, bringing its nose across the tree line one more time, slow enough that anyone still hiding in there would have to make a choice about whether today was the day they wanted to test her. Nobody tested her. The remaining shooter broke cover and ran deeper into the woods, and she let him go because the mission wasn't punishment, it was extraction, and she'd learned that difference a long time ago in a place she still didn't talk about. Back on the flight line, Sullivan watched the whole exchange over the radio with his arms crossed so tight his knuckles had gone pale. Every call she made was a full step ahead of the situation on the ground. He'd flown with plenty of good pilots. He'd never watched one work like she was reading a script only she could see. "Foster," he said low, "get that logging road cleared for a ground evac. Now, she's already 3 moves past us." Reyes and 2 of his soldiers half-carried, half-dragged their wounded toward the logging road under an Apache that hovered close enough to feel like a second skin, its shadow sliding over them the entire way. Sarah kept a running scan on the tree line on the ridge on a stand of rocks to the south. She didn't like the look of cycling through threat priorities in a loop so practiced it barely required conscious thought anymore. "Nightshade, we're at the extraction point. Ground transport is 2 mics out," Reyes called. "Copy. I'll hold overhead until they're wheels up." 2 minutes. She'd held positions longer than that under worse fire, in places with names she'd been ordered never to say again once the paperwork closed. Her hands didn't shake. They never shook, not during the part everyone else found terrifying. Only later, always later, in the quiet after, when there was nothing left to focus on but the silence. A truck rattled into view down the logging road, and Reyes's soldiers loaded the wounded in with the kind of frantic care that meant they'd remember every second of this for the rest of their lives. Sarah watched until the truck cleared the tree line's range, then pulled the Apache back into a wide, unhurried arc toward the flight line. "Vandal 1-6, your wounded are clear. Tree line's quiet."
I'm RTB.
"Copy, Nightshade." And Reyes hesitated, static filling the pause. "Thank you, whoever you are." She didn't answer that one. She never knew what to say to it. The flight back to Fort Caldwell took 6 minutes, and in that time Sarah felt the adrenaline drain out of her the way it always did. Not gradually, but all at once, like a valve closing, leaving behind a bone-deep tiredness that made her hands feel heavier on the controls than they had any right to. She thought about the scar on her forearm. She thought about the name Nightshade sitting out there now on an open radio channel, in a records terminal, in the mouths of soldiers who'd remember it long after they forgot her face. 6 years of quiet, unwound in 4 minutes. She thought about the reason she'd stopped flying Apaches in the first place, and pushed that thought down hardest of all, because some doors didn't open just because the day had gone sideways. Below her, the flight line came into view, and she could already see them. A small cluster of people standing at the edge of the tarmac, Sullivan among them, none of them moving, all of them watching the aircraft descend like it was bringing something back from a place none of them had names for. She set the Apache down exactly where she'd taken off from, cut the engine, and sat there for one long moment before pulling off the helmet, breathing out slow, letting her hands finally, quietly, start to shake now that nobody needed them steady anymore. Sullivan reached the aircraft before the rotors had fully stopped turning, and for a moment he just stood there, staring up at her like he was trying to reconcile the woman who'd rolled a pit special off his flight line that morning with whatever had just happened in that valley. "Captain Bennett," he said. It wasn't a question. Foster had shown him the file. Most of it anyway, the parts that weren't blacked out. Sarah climbed down slowly, legs unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the aircraft. "It's just Sarah now, Chief. You've got a silver star in that sealed file. Classified deployment history. 6 years of nothing. And then you show up at my county airshow flying a crop duster." Sullivan's voice wasn't accusing anymore. It had gone quiet, almost careful. "What happened?" She looked past him, toward the tree line on the horizon, toward the direction the wounded had come from. "I stopped being able to do the part that comes after," she said. "The part where you go home and everybody expects you to be fine." Foster stood a few feet back, helmet still in his hands, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. Sullivan looked at her for a long moment, this woman he'd ordered off his flight line 4 hours ago, and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have a word for yet, something that made the next thing he did feel less like a decision and more like an instinct too old to argue with. He straightened, squared his shoulders, and brought his hand up in a slow, deliberate salute. Sarah froze. Nobody had saluted her in 6 years. She told herself she didn't miss it, and standing there now, feeling the weight of it land on her like something physical, she realized how much of a lie that had been. "Chief, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Sullivan said, holding the salute steady. "I'm doing it because you earned it 4 hours ago, and I was too busy yelling at you to notice." Behind him, Foster straightened up too, and after a beat of hesitation, brought his own hand up, uncertain but sincere, and one by one the soldiers who'd gathered at the edge of the tarmac did the same, until Sarah Bennett, Nightshade, captain, county fair pilot, mechanic in a borrowed flight suit, stood in the middle of a silent salute from people who 2 hours ago hadn't known her name. She returned it because that was what you did, because the body remembered the shape of respect even when the mind had spent 6 years trying to forget it belonged to her. "Thank you," she said quietly, and then, because the silence had gotten too heavy to hold, "Somebody want to help me get my pits back off your grass, Chief?" Sullivan actually laughed. Short, surprised. "Real? Yeah, we'll get you sorted." The rest of the afternoon moved strangely, the way ordinary things do after something extraordinary interrupts them. Ground crews towed Sarah's yellow pits special back onto its patch of grass. Someone brought her a bottle of water she didn't remember asking for. Reyes and his platoon rolled back onto base an hour later, and word had already spread faster than any of them could have run it. Soldiers who'd never met her found reasons to walk past the flight line. A few nodded. One young private, barely out of basic, asked if it was true she'd flown blind through smoke without a working radar warning, and Sarah just said, "Radar was fine. I just didn't need it," and left him to decide what that meant. Foster lingered near the Apache longer than his job required, still holding the helmet he'd handed her that morning, running his thumb over the faint stenciling on the inside band he hadn't had time to read before. Now, in the quiet, he finally looked. 2 letters and a number worn almost to nothing. A unit designation that didn't match anything in the current database, because it wasn't supposed to. He didn't say anything about it. Some things, he was starting to understand, weren't his to ask about yet. Sullivan found her near her aircraft as the lights started going gold, the kind of late afternoon color that made even a training range look almost soft. He held 2 cups of coffee, offered her one without a word. She took it. "You're not going to ask me the rest of it, are you?" "Wasn't planning on it," he said. "Figured a woman who flies like that earns the right to keep some things to herself." Sarah looked down at the coffee, at the steam curling off it, at her own hand wrapped around the cup. Steady now, the shake long since passed. "I appreciate that, Chief. Sullivan's fine. You earned that too." She almost smiled at that. Almost. 6 years. And the first thing anyone in a uniform said to me is my own name back. Nightshade, or Bennett? Both, I guess. Feels strange hearing either one out loud again. Sullivan glanced toward the tree line on the horizon, the one that had gone quiet under her cannon fire that morning, and then back at her. "For what it's worth, Captain, whatever you did out there today, it wasn't just skill. Skill doesn't keep 3 men breathing who'd otherwise be dead in a ditch by nightfall. That's something else." Sarah didn't answer right away. She just watched the sun catch the rotor blades and turned the scar on her forearm, absently, toward the light. That night, Reyes found her sitting alone near the hangar, the airshow crowds long gone, the flight line quiet except for the tick of cooling metal and the distant hum of a generator. He set 2 beers down without asking and sat. "Figured I owed you this much," he said. "You saved my whole squad today, ma'am. You'd have done the same for them without me. Maybe. Wouldn't have been as clean." He turned the bottle in his hands. "Can I ask you something? Not about the file. About the flying." Sarah nodded once. "How'd you know exactly where my wounded were before I finished giving the grid? You called it like you already knew the terrain." She was quiet for a moment, watching the last color drain out of the sky. "Because I've flown that kind of valley before. Different country, different names on the map. Same shape, though. Same mistakes people make when they're scared and pinned down." She took a slow breath. "The terrain doesn't change much. Just the flag on the shoulder patches." Reyes didn't push further. He recognized, in the careful way she chose her words, the shape of things a person carries but doesn't hand out for free. "Well," he said instead, raising his bottle slightly, "wherever that was, I'm glad you came back from it enough to be here today." Sarah didn't sleep well that night, not that anyone who knew her would have expected otherwise. She lay in the guest quarters Fort Caldwell had offered her, an offer she'd almost declined out of habit, and stared at a ceiling that wasn't hers, listening to the sound of a bass at rest, so different from the sound of a bass at war that it almost hurt to notice the difference. The scar on her forearm ached the way it sometimes did on nights like this, a dull phantom pull with no medical explanation anyone had ever given her that made sense. She pressed her thumb against it out of old habit and thought, not for the first time, about the version of herself who used to answer to Nightshade every single day instead of once every 6 years by accident. She thought about Foster's face when he'd handed her that helmet, too young to understand yet what he'd just watched. She thought about Sullivan's salute, held a beat longer than protocol required. She thought about Reyes's question, the one he'd been too respectful to actually finish asking. What happened to you out there that made coming home harder than the war itself? She didn't have an answer for that one either. Not yet, maybe not ever. But for the first time in 6 years, sitting in a strange bed on a base that wasn't hers, she didn't feel like she needed to run from the question quite as fast. By morning, the story had already outgrown the base. Someone had recorded part of the radio traffic. A young soldier's phone propped against a truck window, catching Sarah's voice calling extraction points in that same flat, unshaken tone. And it had made its way, as these things do, into group chats and hallway conversations and eventually a local news tip line nobody at Fort Caldwell had authorized. Sullivan intercepted the reporter before she got past the gate. "There's no story here," he told her, which was, strictly speaking, a lie, but the kind of lie a chief master sergeant tells to protect someone who's earned protecting. Sarah watched the exchange from a distance, her pit special already fueled and ready on the grass, exactly where she'd first tried to roll it before Sullivan told her to get lost that morning. That felt, now, like it belonged to a different life entirely. Foster jogged over as she did her final walk around. "Ma'am, Captain, I just wanted to say, whatever that record says, whatever you can't tell us." He hesitated, 22 years old and suddenly out of words. "Thank you." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, at the same helmet still tucked under his arm, at the careful way he hadn't asked her a single question all day. "Take care of that stencil," she said finally. "It's the only proof that any of this happened." She climbed into the pit special the same way she'd climbed out of it that morning. Quietly, without ceremony, a woman in a faded flight suit doing an ordinary thing. Except this time, the entire flight line had turned out to watch her go. Sullivan stood at the edge of the tarmac, arms crossed, the closest thing to a smile he seemed capable of tugging at one corner of his mouth. Reyes and half his platoon lined up loosely behind him, still in their fatigues from the exercise that had turned into something none of them would forget. Foster stood a little apart, helmet under his arm, watching her the way you watch something you know you'll only get to see once. "You need anything, Captain?" Sullivan called over the engine noise. "You call this base directly. Skip the paperwork." "I plan on it being a quiet drive home, Chief," she called back. "No offense." "None taken. Hope it's boring as hell for you from here on out." She taxied to the edge of the grass, throttle easing up, propeller catching the morning light in flickering arcs. Just before she lifted off, she glanced once more at the small crowd that had gathered. Men and women who 2 days ago wouldn't have looked twice at a woman with grease under her nails, now standing at something close to attention for her. She didn't wave. She just nodded once, the way pilots do when words aren't the right shape for what they mean. The flight home took 40 minutes, low and slow over farmland that didn't ask questions, didn't need explanations, didn't require her to be anyone other than exactly who she decided to be 6 years ago. She landed the pits in the same field she always did, taxied it into the same weathered barn, and killed the engine to a silence broken only by wind moving through corn that was almost tall enough to harvest. Her hands didn't shake anymore. They hadn't since somewhere over the state line, once the adrenaline had finally finished leaving her system for good. Once the version of her that answered to Nightshade had folded itself back into the quieter version that answered to nothing at all. She hung her flight suit on its usual hook. She walked past the workbench where a half-repaired carburetor sat waiting, exactly where she'd left it 2 days ago, back when the biggest problem in her life had been a sticky fuel line and an airshow schedule. Outside, the tractor needed its oil changed. The fence on the north pasture needed mending. Ordinary things, the kind of things that didn't ask her to be extraordinary, the kind of things she'd built an entire second life around because they didn't come with sealed files or silver stars or names that made rooms go quiet. She picked up a wrench, turned the carburetor over in her hands, and got back to work. 3 days later, a letter arrived, no return address, government stationery, the kind of envelope that used to make her stomach drop and now just made her tired. Inside was a single line, typed, and signed except for a rank and a set of initials she recognized from a life she tried hard to leave behind. Your record stays sealed. Your choice always. Just know some of us still remember what Nightshade did, even if the paperwork doesn't. She read it twice, then folded it and put it in the same drawer where she kept the few things from that other life she hadn't been able to throw away. Patch. A photograph she never looked at anymore. A small, tarnished pin that had once meant something to people who no longer existed in any capacity she could reach. Underneath the letter, a second smaller piece of paper. A name and a phone number, unfamiliar. If you ever want to talk to someone who understands the part that comes after, it read in different handwriting. No pressure. No paperwork. Just a number. She stared at that one longer than the first. For 6 years, she hadn't called anyone. For 6 years, she'd told herself the quiet life was enough, that the ache in her arm and the sleepless nights were simply the price she'd already agreed to pay. She didn't call that day, but she didn't throw the number away either. And for Sarah Bennett, that was closer to progress than anyone watching from the outside would ever understand. Word from Fort Caldwell trickled in over the following weeks in small, unofficial ways. A thank you card from Reyes's wife, a photo Foster sent of the helmet, its stencil now carefully protected under a strip of clear tape so it would never wear away again. Sullivan called once, gruff and brief, mostly to confirm she'd landed fine, partly, she suspected, just to hear that she still existed out there somewhere, ordinary and unremarkable and alive. She went back to flying the airshow circuit that summer, looping her yellow pits over county fairs and cheering crowds who had no idea what her hands had done 2 weeks earlier in a valley none of them would ever hear about. She signed a few autographs. She let a little girl sit in the cockpit and pretend to fly. She smiled, tired but real. The way she used to before 6 years of silence had taught her to keep her face carefully unreadable. At night, sometimes, she still pressed her thumb against the scar on her forearm and felt the old ache settle in. But it was a little quieter now than it used to be. Being seen once, really seen by people who'd watched what she could do and chosen to salute instead of question, had loosened something she hadn't realized was still locked so tight. She kept the letter in the drawer. She kept the phone number folded inside it. Someday, she thought, not yet, but someday. If this story hit you somewhere, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps this channel more than you'd know. Drop a comment and tell me. If you were Sullivan, standing on that flight line, would you have saluted her the same way, or needed more convincing first? And if stories about hidden heroes and quiet courage are your kind of thing, go ahead and subscribe, because there's another one coming soon. Thanks for watching. Take care of each other out there.